And welcome to the Roadshow edition of Gridiron Nation, everyone. I'm Jim Mullin, continuing on the road in Europe, joined by Gord Randall, keeping the home fires burning. Gord, let's talk about the NCAA first off, and Canadians in the NCAA. And the one thing that becomes clearly apparent is that we've got some great athletes on some pretty bad teams this year. None other than Rutgers is a really good example of that, losing to Illinois with some players that were tested throughout the lineup that showed well in a pretty significant loss.
Yeah, we at the start of the season talked a little bit about how Rutgers has kind of taken the mantle of the Team Canada in the NCAA with three very prominent Canadians on the roster and a couple others making an impact here and there too. And the challenge for them has been, while things look quite promising for them in non-conference play, they've fallen mostly flat in Big Ten play. They dropped the game to Illinois this past weekend. That puts them at 1-5 in Big Ten play, and scratching and clawing for the 6 wins so that we can potentially see them in a bowl game in December is kind of the last saving grace on their schedule. They do have a couple potentially winnable games, but that being said, they've also just lost a couple potentially winnable games in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So it's hard to know what to make of this Rutgers team. And as they've run into some stiffer defenses, and I don't want to sell Illinois short, that's a legitimate top 25 team this year. But as they've run into stiffer defenses, Antoine Raymond has started to slow down a little bit on the offensive side. On the defensive side, Jet Eli's been very prominent. He's racking up some counting stats. Daryl Jabome, who had dealt with some injury issues and actually briefly left this game with a concussion, or a possible concussion, I guess. Returned to the game and racked up some really good counting stats in this game. Jabril Abdurrahman checks in with a contribution on the defensive side as well. So we're seeing our Canadian guys get a chance to show out at Rutgers, but the challenge is that Rutgers, unfortunately, is just not quite up to the grade in Big Ten play this season. Ethan Kaliakmanis, their quarterback, has kind of taken a step back, in my opinion, and it's been a tough grind for them. So here's hoping that they can right the ship and at least get themselves that magic 6-6 number, so we can see something in postseason play from them.
Ty Benefield has to be considered seriously at this stage for the Cornish Trophy, the safety out of Vancouver that plays for Boise State. Boise State with a strange season, to say the least, in, quite frankly, a strange conference. Clear that up for everyone out there.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about Boise State's season to begin with. And, we weren't sure what to make of this squad after losing such a transcendent player as Ashton Jeanty after last season. Of course, lest we forget, they were in the national playoff last season, and they kind of fell flat to start with, right? They get the doors blown off them by South Florida, bounced back and looked fantastic for a stretch of about 6 weeks in between, including a narrow loss at Notre Dame, which looks like a legitimate top 10 team at this point too. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I have to take a bit of a mea culpa because I kind of just brushed off this Fresno State matchup this week and forgot the golden rule in college football, is that absolutely anything can happen at any time, especially in a rivalry game, which Fresno and Boise is. So Fresno 30-7 is the win. A really disappointing effort for Boise State. And now that Mountain West has all of a sudden gotten quite complicated. There's about 5 teams with 2 losses in a log jam. And amongst those lurking are UNLV, who Dan Mullen's done a pretty good job with this season. New Mexico, who beat UCLA on the road earlier this season and just blew the doors off of UNLV this past weekend. And Hawaii, that we've talked about on this program quite a bit as well. Boise's alone at 1 loss, but there's a bunch of teams right behind him in the rearview mirror lurking. And then there's San Diego State, who's sitting on top of the conference, undefeated so far in conference play. What's interesting about this, too, is that a lot of the teams that are moving over to this newly formed Pac-12 next year are, it's not exclusively, but are in this logjam towards the top of the playoff. I mentioned San Diego State at the top, then Boise State. Fresno's in that group at 2 losses. They're moving over as well. So it's Utah State. So it's shaping up to be a really interesting final year of this iteration of the Mountain West, but also setting up for a pretty interesting and competitive Pac-12 moving forward as you add these Mountain West teams into Washington State and Oregon State, who are awaiting them.
Kind of reminds me of how great the Pac-12 was in its last year before there were only 2 left. Let's see how many players Alex gets to roll through in this week's edition of Border Ballers.
Welcome back to Border Ballers. I want to tell you about Mauricio, Darius, and my other brother Darius, just in case there's any Newhart fans here. Anyway, Mauricio Hines had a bye this weekend, but last week the offensive lineman from Porters Lake, Nova Scotia earned his first start at right guard for FAU. Hines stonewalled a then undefeated Navy, which had to pull out its nautical charts to find a path around him. He allowed just a single hurry on nearly 70 passing plays, a phenomenal start to his college career in the Sunshine State. Another Canadian hog on the O-line because we love our big boys, Darius Bell. East Carolina's favorite Hamiltonian has yet to allow a sack or a QB hit on that Pirates offense with just 7 pressures given up through 10 weeks, according to PFF. ECU has collected the 3rd most yards per game in the American Conference, in part due to one of the best centers on the block. Darius McKenzie, my other brother Darius, just had his 3rd consecutive double-digit tackle game this season. Around the same time last year, the Pride of Ottawa elevated his game, and it looks like the same is happening in 2025 with McKenzie swarming to the ball more each week. That's it for Border Ballers. I'll see you on Saturday.
So, Gord, who is your NCAA Player of the Week?
You know, I really wanted to shout out Darius McKenzie here, and I was originally going to choose him. 11 tackles for South Alabama this past weekend, leading them on defense again, as South Alabama unfortunately loses again to fall to 2-6. But I have said the phrase, Ty Benefield had a great week this week, but I want to point out to somebody else, and I don't want to keep doing that week after week. We cannot say enough about Ty Benefield, and I get that this was a disappointing performance for his team, but from a safety position, he led the team with 11 tackles. 9 of those were solo tackles. That is a really impressive under-the-radar stat. And I know that you might be rolling your eyes, what tackles are an under-the-radar stat. Not enough people pay attention to the breakdown of what the solo tackles are there. And with Ty Benefield, we're not talking just push the guy out of bounds most of these times. We're talking form, wrap up, get the guy to the ground type tackles. For a guy in the secondary to be that sure of a tackler is a really impressive trait, and something, we've talked at length about this, but something that just builds his pro resume up stronger and stronger. I cannot say enough how impressed I am with the game for our young man out of Boise.
You know, there is a group of Canadians that we haven't talked about this week, but who are they in your game of the week?
The team that we should be keeping both our eyes fixed upon these days, especially given the nosedive from the Miami Hurricanes the last couple weeks, and that's the Louisville Cardinals. They are very clearly, I wouldn't even say lurking anymore in the ACC. They might be the front runner in the ACC with Georgia Tech slipping up this past weekend, and it sure looks destined for them to have a really good shot at getting into the ACC title game with a schedule that's not overly imposing in conference play leading into it, plus a weak Kentucky team. And now you start to factor in, okay, well, is this the team that we might start be talking about in the national playoff? ACC sent 2 teams last year to that national playoff, Clemson and SMU. Both of those went pretty poorly, but they went there. So for Louisville, that's the task in front of them, is to hold serve through the regular season, get yourself into the ACC title game, bank that SEC win against a Kentucky squad that might well be with an interim coach by that point in time, and put yourself in a position where no one can deny you that top 12 spot for the playoff. Our Canadian guys we've talked about at length of the show, Renee Conga, Wesley Bailey, they and the rest of their Louisville teammates host Cal this weekend in a classic Atlantic Coast matchup featuring a team from Berkeley, California. So that should be an interesting one. Cal is frisky. They've got a really talented freshman quarterback on one side. They've got Justin Wilcox and a very well-coached defense on the other side. Louisville should have the talent advantage, but they need to hold serve this week.
Let's take a time out. When we come back, we'll talk about U Sports. High school football coaches nominate your players for the NFL Canada Way to Play Awards. Each week, winners earn a $3,000 equipment grant for their school program. Show us game footage that highlights safe, proper technique, and impactful play. Winners announced weekly on NFL Live and on NFL Canada's social channels. Learn more at NFL.com/CA Way to Play. U Sports playoffs are well underway. Well, we'll say conference playoffs are well underway. U Sports is only responsible for the national semifinals and the Vanier Cup. And there's been a fair bit of entertainment. I think the most entertainment is out of Ontario. And, man, let's give the Guelph Griffins credit for putting on a show for us in these playoffs. Unfortunately, they exit stage right thanks to a loss to Laurier. But where was this team all year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a young team growing into some things, and a coaching staff that, this is only their second season there. So I think they're still trying to get their feet underneath them and figure out exactly what it is that they want to do. But I was really impressed with the growth from Mark Suria's squad this year. It was really a step in the right direction. They beat Western, obviously, the week before. And this week they take Laurier right down to the wire. And I think what was most impressive was this was a very different type of ball game than the previous week at Western. The previous week at Western was a defensive standoff. The winning score was 18 points. Well, this week they go toe-to-toe with the highly explosive Laurier offense and are on the wrong side of a 37-30 scoreline. So a really encouraging finish to the season for a Guelph squad that will definitely be one to watch out for next fall in the OUA. And in the other OUA semi, gonna give some credit to Queens. Queens, and led by their big-time running back, Jared Cesare, go all the way down to Windsor and make up for that last-second field goal loss at home a few weeks earlier, defeating the Lancers on the road to punch their tickets. So that sets up a pretty interesting Yates Cup matchup between a Queens squad and a Laurier squad that maybe didn't picture this being the matchup at the beginning of the year, but I think a Queens squad that has very much earned their way there, but facing a Laurier squad that might have already had their token scare that every championship team kind of needs to face at some points in the late fall.
Let's go over to the Canada West, where the most exciting game was between Regina and Manitoba. You mentioned field goals. There were a number of key field goals down the stretch in the fourth quarter and then into overtime, and that sets up all province of Saskatchewan final for the Hardy Cup.
It does, and frankly, the Huskies kind of barely broke a sweat. Drew Viotto picked off 3 times in this game, and whatever magic UBC had kind of bottled to get themselves in down the stretch went up in smoke in a hurry, unfortunately. And so for the Huskies, this was kind of a pretty casual dress rehearsal leading into what should be a more intense matchup. Now, the quarterback position with both of these teams, obviously we focus on quarterback a lot, but there's some interesting storylines at both. We've mentioned that Anton Amundrud's status is still up in the air. We don't know what it's going to be for this game, and of course, the team's going to be super tight-lipped, but he again didn't play this past weekend in the STEMI, so it's worth wondering if we're going to see him again this year. And over in Regina, well, it appears there's officially been a changing of the guard the past couple weeks, as Noah Pelche is not the starting quarterback with the Regina Wrens anymore, to put it bluntly. Owen Simon, the Coquitlam, BC native, has taken that job over. And as a guy that saw him in high school, Simon's always had the physical talent. He's big, lanky, effortless throwing motion. It appears he's finally blossomed and come into his own, and he's led them to that last second loss against UBC, he was still pretty good in that game. So he leads them to victory this past weekend in a real tight back and forth affair with a Manitoba team that kept getting better as the season progressed. So it should be a really interesting matchup. Again, worth noting, these teams only played once in the regular season, the Huskies winning that matchup, which is why this game is going to be in Saskatoon this weekend.
Who's your U Sports Player of the Week?
Boy, there were some really impressive performances, especially from receivers this week. Ryan Hughes at Laurier went off over 160 yards and a couple touchdowns receiving. But I'm going to talk primarily about one Laval guy, but we'll start with this guy right over my shoulder here. I know Desjardins was slinging it in their semifinal against McGill. Only 6 incompletions, over 350 yards passing, and 4 touchdowns. But Jim, all 4 of those touchdowns went to his buddy Olivier Cool. 150 yards receiving and 4 house calls for the Laurier star at the receiving position. Olivier Cool is my unquestioning player of the week.
Do you have an unquestioning game of the week coming up in the U Sports playoffs?
Not really, because I think that the 3 major conferences finals are all pretty compelling matchups. As predicted, Montreal and Laval both appear to be getting themselves into 5th gear at just the right time. Montreal blew the doors off Concordia this week, and Laval blew the doors off McGill. So they both appear to be firing on all cylinders. Out in the OUA, we already touched on that matchup, and out west, I think if I had to give the edge, maybe that one, just because I think the all Saskatchewan matchup is pretty compelling, but it's hard to sell short the classic LaBelle Montreal matchup, and it's hard to sell short an OUA that always seems to be pretty topsy-turvy when the playoffs come. So I'm interested in all three of those matchups. And then, in the AUS, I will point out that St. Mary's appears to be the class of that conference. They'll be hosting St. FX, but they blew them out a couple weeks ago. They blew out their semifinal opponents. So I don't necessarily have high hopes for that game being particularly compelling, but I thought it was worth mentioning at least anyway.
Well, now the next time I appear on this, I will be in Milan, Italy, because it'll be the second game of the Gridiron Nations Cup. Here it is right here, made in 1888. How about that? And that will be between Italy and Canada the following week. Canada will be playing Germany. If Italy finds a way to beat Canada, by the way, Italy will be the winner of this thing, as Italy defeated Germany in the European Final Four. So look for that on IFAF TV. So for everyone here on Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullin saying, hey, let's get out to the game, wherever it happens to be.